All right, hello everyone. Thank you for coming out, and I hope that you find this meeting as useful and enlightening as I do. As the president of the Author Social Society, abbreviation to be determined, I come to answer your questions about dialogue. We've passed around a box for you to write anonymous questions, and I'll read them up here on stage. But by the end of this brief, you should have all the knowledge that you need to write good dialogue. Rick Rod with the Right Writers? Carson, what is the biggest mistake that authors can make when writing dialogue? That's a great question, Rick. The biggest mistake that writers can make with dialogue is not understanding their characters enough to write dialogue in their voice. It makes all the dialogue sound the same, but the core of the issue isn't in the dialogue, it's in the author not fully knowing their characters yet. And you fix that in your next edit. Hamstring Jones with the daily dialogue. Should I write my main character with an accent? No. Next question. My name is Thelonious Felonious. Why would you die a log? Security, shoot him. Mac in Anya with the word birds. How exactly should an author... Sorry, Mac, we have our box of anonymous donations. Let's give these a chance. Okay, the first one. What colors would you suggest that we dye our logs? Shoot him again. A portion of this video is sponsored by ProWritingAid. Oh, that pesky dialogue. It's a constant worry in the hearts of emerging writers. If you haven't seen it yet, check out the first two parts of this series on dialogue here. The first video teaches you the basics of dialogue, how much dialogue you should write, and the 4 formatting rules that you have to follow. The second part is a breakdown of the most popular writing book on dialogue, Robert McKee's Dialogue. This part answers every single question that you've posted in the comments of those videos and in the Discord. If you haven't checked it out yet, you totally should. It is a great place to share your writing, get feedback, ask questions, and just be surrounded by like-minded, supportive writing friends. Link below. So this video took a while to put together because I released my first book last month. This is Starlight Farm's Kennel for Talking Dogs. With it, I released a 4-part series breaking down every step to writing this book with examples from this book. If you've ever wanted to know how to write a book, this is a great place to start. And pick it up in the link below to support this channel. It's a really good book. It's really cute. One last thing before we get started. This is a pet peeve of mine, and I promise you that I won't do it. I will not answer your questions with the phrase, "it depends." I hate when I ask for someone's advice, for their guidance, for a tip in writing, and I get that middling answer of, well, it depends. There may be different ways to approach the answer to a question, and I will give you those answers. I will not say, "it depends," and leave you without actionable information. Rant over, let's get to the dialogue. I organized these questions into categories, and the first one here is character voice. A lot of writers struggle with finding that voice with their character, that unique voice. The word choice and the subtext that represents the character simply through their words. This is what makes one character unique from another character when they're speaking. And at its core, this worry and this sort of failure for distinction comes from a disconnect between the author and the character they're writing. You know, maybe disconnect is not like a great word for it. Maybe a better word would be some sort of lack of confidence in understanding your character. Providing your character with a distinctive voice goes so much further than something like, I don't know, giving them an accent. We'll get to that later. Or making them speak in a distinctly different way from another character. A distinctive voice is informed by a specific character's worldview, their motivations, and their fears, and their desires, and more. You can look back on that video in Robert McKee's Dialogue where he talks about the 3 levels of dialogue: the said, the unsaid, and the unsayable. Okay, the said is what the character speaks. It is their words on the page, right? The unsaid is the subtext beneath their words. And the unsayable are the motivations and the fears that that character feels but would never speak. But it directs their actions and their words. The unsayable is like the intrinsic parts of your character that would only come out after a couple therapy sessions. Watch that video for better examples than that. So here's the thing to remember. You develop these distinctive voices for your characters through exposure, through writing them, through understanding them, spending time with them. And that doesn't happen in the introduction of your first draft. That happens after you spent dozens of hours writing these characters and guiding them through their character journey, right? Once you've taken a character from introduction to resolution and you've seen their journey, their highs and their lows, you've seen them achieve what they need to achieve, then you can go back in your next draft and really make that character unique, distinct. Anne Lamott in Bird by Bird likens spending time with your characters to watching a Polaroid of them slowly develop. And the biggest thing here is not to expect your character to have that super distinctive voice in your proto draft. Maybe you're lucky, but usually you're not. This is your chance to explore your character, learn their quirks, and develop that voice. You discover this through editing. And editing is hard. Luckily, you can make it easier with ProWritingAid. ProWritingAid is the storyteller's toolkit. It helps you become the strongest writer you can be by giving you actionable feedback to make your writing better. I picked up a lifetime subscription to ProWritingAid 4 years ago because I knew that it would be a critical part in my writing process. The ProWritingAid Desktop Everywhere app lets you get their powerful writing feedback anywhere that you can enter text. And that means that it integrates with Microsoft Word and Google Docs and Obsidian and any other tool that you want to write in. ProWritingAid provides line edits, but also larger writing feedback through their powerful reports. I like the critique report, which looks at my writing and gives me feedback regarding the characters and the dialogue and the pacing and the style of writing and so much more. I've also found that the sentence readability and the sentence length reports really helpful in making sure that my book stays fun to read. In fact, I use ProWritingAid to edit my most recent book, Starlight Farm's Kennel for Talking Dogs. And without ProWritingAid, this book would not be nearly as put together as it ended up being. So thank you to ProWritingAid for making editing easy and for supporting small creators. You can use my code WritingTheory10 at checkout to get 10% off of your order. Now, that advice is for creating distinctive voices in your main characters, but what about characters that are more one-off, like side characters? One question asked this in regards to elderly characters versus younger characters. How do you make them distinctive? And this is where you write to a stereotype. Now, it's up to you how much you want to lean into that stereotype. An older character may speak in a more, let's say, archaic way of talking than a child, or they may have specific ideas about how certain things should be done, and that's informed by their life experiences. A child may be more naive, and that's informed by their lack of life experiences. To make these characters sound distinctive in their dialogue, those intrinsic qualities need to be present in what they say. And this can come out in things like word choice, but also in things like understanding societal norms. Like the child may ask an inappropriate question in efforts to understand what's happening around them, or it can come through intention. An older character might want to voice their opinions because they think XYZ should be done in a certain way, while a younger character might be trying to learn and absorb what's happening around them. They might look up to certain characters that they admire and adopt those ideas and talking points. But dialogue is almost always paired with action. So that's another place to extend that distinctive voice. Pair it with action. A child may always be moving around because they have so much energy. An elderly character might be the exact opposite. Another question asked if a character has a certain established accent. Would it be acceptable to write it in or to sprinkle it throughout the story if the intended dialogue delivery accounted for it? And this is definitely something worth talking about. In my opinion, editor Carson, editor, future editor, put this up here, in my opinion, writing out an accent is oftentimes a bad idea. Your main character should not have an accent that's represented in the dialogue. Let me explain. The most important thing that you need to do as an author is to make the reading experience easy and pleasant, and that is a skill that you learn in writing and editing. The second your story becomes hard to read, that's when you start losing readers. And dialogue is one of the best ways that readers experience characters. Writing dialogue with some sort of chopped up accent is a poor reading experience, and it gets between your readers and your characters. So what does this mean for accents? Accents in a character that have a lot of speaking lines should not be represented in the dialogue. One-off or minor characters that have accents that are important to the story in some way can be written in. If you still want to emphasize the accent in the dialogue of a main character, there are two ways to do so. The first way is through word choice. Include specific words present in that accent within the dialogue, but write everything out normally, where it's easy to read. For example, the Scottish accent is a heavy hitter. It's tough. Writing out that accent in dialogue might look something like this. Hey, it's effective. I can read this and I can hear that dialect. But if this was a main character, I don't want to read hundreds of lines of dialogue and work on parsing this information out, this meaning. Leave it to your reader to convert normal dialogue into that dialect or accent. If you're able to, then establish your character as speaking through this sort of accent and write the dialogue on the page normally. Let the reader do the work. With a main character, establish the accent and use one or two keywords from that dialect in your normal dialogue to remind the reader that this is the character speaking with that accent. In the case of the Scottish dialect, I would choose the words that replace common words like I for yes or come here for come here. And I chose these specifically because they aren't going to be present in every sentence. And it's not a misspelling of another word that might require the reader to do some translation in their head. I would not choose a replacement word for something that could be present in nearly every sentence. Instead, I'd let the reader experience that accent in their own mind. The second way of representing accents is through narration and reader trust. You can see there's a theme here of trusting the reader. Trust your reader to remember that your main characters speak differently. Present it as part of your storytelling. Have some people note that these characters speak in unexpected accents, or they have trouble understanding them, or note that these main characters that we're experiencing with these accents are outsiders in this land of different accents. But side characters, one-off characters, have some fun with it. Throw some accents in there, just don't do it with your main characters and make a bad reading experience. Our next question has to do with cliches, and I love this topic. Let's talk about cliches. The question is, how can you avoid cliched dialogue? And what could be some commonly used cliche lines that would be best avoided in different genres? Okay, let me start by asking you something. What is a cliche? Most would probably compare it to some sort of overused trope, maybe a sign of lazy writing or something that's been overdone, but a cliche isn't specifically a bad thing. There are different levels of cliche. So let's start with what a bad cliche is. A bad cliche is something that makes you feel like your story isn't unique. It makes the reader feel like your story isn't unique. A line of dialogue isn't going to do that. And some of this may come down to personal taste, probably a lot of it actually. I would consider a bad cliche as something that is out of place in your story. If your story takes itself super seriously, like a East of Eden kind of story, and then you drop in a cliche like this town ain't big enough for the two of us, or I'm here to chew gum and kick butt and I'm all out of gum, or I'm getting too old for this stuff, then that would feel very out of place in a serious story. But if you're writing a story that's designed to be fun to read, don't feel like a cliche line of dialogue is out of the question. You can have fun scenes even if your story is somewhat serious. Having a character talk bad about another character and then hitting you with a, they're right behind me, aren't they? is a cliche, but it's fun. It's a fun scene. It puts the characters in a fun situation. And especially if the reader and maybe even the characters are somewhat in on the joke. Look, every cliche started with a really good moment of a story. Every cliche origin story is that moment in a movie or a book that had the audience astounded because it was such a unique take on something. I guarantee you that the first time a character uttered, "Now it's personal," the audience was flabbergasted. That line goes hard. But it's a different level of cliche than They're Behind Me, aren't they? One is a fun cliche, and one is a cliche born from a serious moment that's been repeated time and time again in serious moments until it lost its effectiveness. Those are bad cliches, and this is up to you and your taste to determine when, where, and why to use a cliche. Because it's also up to the reader to decide if that cliche lands or not. Here's a good tip, and this is applied to a whole bunch of other things. Write to your own taste and attract readers with the same taste. It makes life a lot easier. Our next question is in regards to character relationships. How do people in different kinds of relationships speak to each other? And I think this comes down to chemistry, closeness, support, and history. 4 elements here. Now, this question focuses on the differences of platonic, familial, and romantic relationships. And each one is going to have a different combination of chemistry and intimacy and support and history. Platonic friends will always have chemistry and history, but maybe not intimacy. Maybe platonic friends might support each other, but not in the way that a romantic relationship or a familial relationship would. I think you kind of get what I'm saying. I could go on a huge rant about all these different levels of things, but these sorts of things inform how the dialogue presents in your story. Each relationship has a different history, different maybe nicknames, different levels of closeness and support, and different levels of holding each other accountable. Next up is cringy banter. This one's short and sweet. First, I think that most banter and dialogue that you create is not cringy. But if you do really think that what you're writing is cringy, then here is the best piece of advice that I can give you. Putting your characters into a situation where they are standing around and just talking is more likely to result in dialogue that feels pointless and or lame and or cringy. So step 1 to avoiding cringy banter is to always have your scenes and your characters doing something important and give your characters something important to talk about. Step 2 is to keep conversations in theme and appropriate. When I've encountered cringy dialogue, it's been due to the author having a message that's spoken through the characters that doesn't quite feel like it should be part of your story. So, don't do that. How do you make sure that you have enough narration between your dialogue? Now, while this presents as a question about dialogue, it's more of a question about pacing, because pacing an entire novel is how quickly the events of your story plays out, but in a micro sense, pacing is the amount of information you provide outside of dialogue. The more information you can present through character interactions and dialogue, the quicker your story can move. And of course, you can do this to a fault. We aren't all Hemingway, if you know what I mean. So what's the answer here? It comes down to the pacing of each scene. When things are moving slower, like your characters entering a city for the first time, lean into writing more description into the narration about the setting and the movements of the characters. In a fast-paced scene, like running through the alleys of the city to escape the pursuing guards, you want to keep things moving quickly. Put information into the action and the dialogue. Every bit of information between the dialogue should include purpose and action. A line that doesn't present purpose and action slows your story down. So this is all about pacing, and that's also how you make a story feel dynamic. Have both scenes with fast pacing and slow pacing, exciting moments for the reader and moments of rest. A lot of questions came up about formatting. At the very bare minimum, check out the 4 main rules of formatting dialogue in the first video of this series. But there are also resources in the description of that video that link to some really good videos and web articles that I found. Okay, so let's talk about how much dialogue. In that first video, I took a sampling of a couple books from different genres, and I counted their lines of dialogue and I averaged it out. That study says that you should have about 34 lines of dialogue per 1,000 words. Check that video for more information. Next, there's a lot of debate around action tags and dialogue tags. So first, let's understand the difference. An action tag follows or precedes dialogue with that speaking character performing action. A dialogue tag is simply like a they said or some variant of that follows dialogue. It doesn't perform any extra function besides telling the reader who is speaking this line of dialogue. Okay, so now let's understand what good action tags are. Let's look at the line, "I learned to pick locks when I was young." And it can be presented in these three ways. "I learned to pick locks when I was young," she said. "I learned to pick locks when I was young," she smiled. "I learned to pick locks when I was young." Her teeth clicked against the lockpick pinned in her mouth. These three versions of dialogue are paced differently. Consider what comes after each one of these sentences. Our first two options sort of wrap up the dialogue line. What happens next is a completely new line of action. But our last line of dialogue, our last example with this action tag is multifunctional. And in a world where your book may have 2,000 lines of dialogue, writing more efficiently is a big deal. How many dialogue lines should have action beats? I say use your traditional said, asked, etc. dialogue tags 80% of the time and reserve quick-paced action tags for when the action of your story needs it. And use your gut. If you're writing dialogue and you start to feel like it's too much of the same, then follow that instinct. Your gut is usually right. If you find that you're using traditional dialogue tags too much, then spice it up. Inject some action and focus more on what your characters are doing. Should you break up dialogue with monologues? Now, I assume by monologue you mean internal monologue, like the narration in like a first-person story. You should not force any internal narration where it doesn't feel right. But if your character needs to process information that the reader needs to be aware of, like they just learned something new and they're trying to understand that, then yes, throw some internal monologue in there. But don't go out of your way to shoehorn internal monologues, or your story's pacing will get ruined. Where should you sprinkle in dialogue? Now, this question is in regards to sort of side dialogue, I think is how they phrase it. Things not said in traditional dialogue. They mean like whispers to oneself or a comment under the breath. My answer? Don't use these things if you're following traditional writing rules. That's not a commonplace thing. This seems like a trope of another medium like anime or theater. In traditional writing, these sort of things would be handled in first-person internal narration, which you can inject anywhere in your story. But if you're adding tropes of anime into your writing, like the main character thinking out loud about what's going to happen if this big bad guy uses all of their power and how hopeless the situation is, then lean into it. Write like you would internal narration. And if you aren't writing in the first person, then I would avoid trying to add this kind of injection into your story. I can't speak for everyone, but I don't often whisper to myself in the middle of conversation with another person or big anime fights. How do you balance dialogue in scenes with a lot of characters while giving everyone a voice and not making it too chaotic or lasting too long? Easy one. The answer here is that everyone should not get a voice at the same time. Think of something like this Ocean's 11 scene. We have a group of characters here and the conversation is really being championed by George Clooney's character with additional comments by Brad Pitt's character. Any additional dialogue that a character contributes showcases something important about that character or their desires, but the scene is led by Clooney and Pitt. So let's imagine that this conversation wasn't one of planning a heist, but a disagreement on how to plan the heist. Maybe some people are into the idea and some people think that it's too risky. Instead of writing a scene where everyone is given equal time, give one character on each side of the debate the role of the champion. They are the ones who are most passionate about their argument. When there's discourse, show it in the rumblings of the other characters, of the other crowd. Maybe throw one-off lines to certain characters to support one side or the other with information that's important to that one-off character's desires. This should be a glimpse into that character, not just a meaningless voice of agreement. The important thing here is that it is so much easier to follow two sides of an argument than a dozen sides organized into two groups. Use a champion. And with that, all of your submitted dialogue questions are answered. I hope you find this video helpful. If you like breaking down story and becoming a better writer, then subscribe to this channel. We also have a great Discord you can join in, share your writing, get feedback, and more. Check out the link below and I'll see you there. And as always, thank you for watching.